Hey everyone, welcome to my second of 3 videos on the Nikon D100. And in this video we're going to go over all of the functions except the menu system. And in the third video we'll cover the menu system and how all of that works. First thing we have to do though is this is a digital camera. You're going to do nothing whatsoever except set it on your shelf or use it to keep papers next to your window from blowing away without a battery. So to change the battery, first I'm going to turn this off just out of habit, no specific reason to. To open up the battery chamber, we come down here and we push this release toward the inside of the camera and pull open the battery door. We pull out this battery right here, which is a Nikon, well, this one isn't, but it's an EN-EL3 battery. I do think that these have been discontinued by Nikon, but you can still get third-party options. They don't last quite as long as the old Nikons did, but they'll last. They're okay batteries to use. In fairness, I put this battery into this camera a year ago and then set it off to the side to make this video about. And it's been sitting in there a year, and the LCD with the CF card with the photos remaining has been on the entire time, and the battery shows no sign of being drained at all. So third-party batteries for a camera like this, probably going to be just fine. There's only one way to insert the battery because of the shape of it. If I try inserting it backwards, I'm not going to get very far. It's only going to let me push it in. Well, I guess it's going to let me push it in the whole way, but I'm not going to be able to close the door. So you do want to make sure the contacts are facing into the camera, and then you just insert the battery the only way it can go in. Like that. When you close the battery door, it's a good idea to take the clip and push it in towards the door so that you retract this little bit of it right here. The reason for that being that these are old pieces of plastic. I mean, they're 20 years old, but that's still kind of old, right? So you push this in, you push the door shut, and then you release and push this out if you need to. And what that's going to do is that's going to make sure that you protect that clip. If you break the clip, you're going to have to replace the battery door, which isn't impossible, but it's always better not to replace something than to have to replace it. All right, battery in. Next thing we have to do is put in a CF card. So we're going to open up the CF card door right here. To remove a CF card, if you have one in there, you simply push down right here and then lift to remove the CF card. This has an 8 gig CF card, which can hold, I think I saw it, about 390 raw files. So we'll see that a little bit more throughout the course of this video. I could not find a maximum size for CF cards that this can hold. My largest CF card is only 16 gigs. I did try it in here. It worked just fine. But that said, I got the sense from using this that the camera could only use 4 gigs of those 16 gigs. So it's distinctly possible that putting something larger than 4 gigs into this camera does not give you more usable memory. With this camera, the uncompressed raw files that it creates give you approximately 100 files per gigabyte, and this 8 gigabyte card is only holding 394, which would back up the idea that the camera can only utilize 4 of the gigs on your CF card. One other thing about CF cards is there's really no reason to go larger than 4, because the larger your CF card is, the longer it takes the camera to initialize it when you turn on. So that can get kind of annoying. So if you stick with a 4 gig CF card, you're going to be just fine. To install your CF card, it's really pretty easy. All you have to do is insert it like this so that the logo side of the CF card is facing the outside of the camera. Push it into the slot gently and in. Green light will initialize or light up to let you know it's initializing. This will poke out to let you know that it's seated. Now you can close the CF card door. Okay, so we've got a battery, we've got a CF card. Let's mount a lens. So to mount a lens, we're going to place it on this ring. This can take DX and FX format F-mount lenses. It does not have a meter coupling ring up here, which means that you can safely mount NAI lenses on here without risking damage to the camera, but metering them can be kind of a pain. So, do I even have one? Well, this is an AI lens, but I should be able to illustrate the exact same principle here. We're going to put on the AI lens right here, okay? And I'm going to set this at f22, turn the camera on, and it's in bulb mode. And if I push the shutter button, you can see there that the aperture has stopped down. So for instance, if I was out in full sun at 100 ISO, I'd know that I would need a shutter speed of about 1/50th of a second at f22 with this lens. However, if I am in any of the automatic modes, which we'll talk about in detail later, they will only meter this lens at f2 because they are not getting any information about the aperture the camera is set at from the lens. Here it is, of course, the depth of field preview. So with this, what you do with older lenses is you use the depth of field preview. I'm going to switch to automatic mode. Well, it was working, and now it is just giving me R04, R06, and a couple of others. And the camera is no longer stopping down the depth of field preview either. Let's see if mounting a proper lens will get this guy working again. Well, still giving me R04 and R03. It seems to be working again. Oh, R04, that's the remainder. That's right. I always forget it with these older ones. It's not an error that it's giving me. It's just saying remainder 4. That's how many more images I can take before I run out of buffer. Okay. Anyway, it did not like using this AIS lens at all. So the best advice I'm going to have for you with lenses with this camera is stick with the electronic contact F lenses, like this one, which is the 18 to 55 DX VR lens. I am certain that there's a way to do depth of field preview and to use aperture priority mode with legacy lenses on this. I'm not going to lie, I don't know how to do it. Somebody in the comment section will almost certainly put some pointers on how to do that. So if you want to try that, check it out below. Anyway, to remove a lens is very simple. You find the lens release button and you push it down. Then you turn the lens clockwise. Yeah, that's right, clockwise until it stops and you can lift it off. To put a new lens on, you find the white dot on the lens, the white dot on the camera's body. No coincidence there. Line them up and turn it counterclockwise until it clicks into place. And now the lens has been loaded and remounted and is ready to use. So we talked a little bit about the drive modes in the first video. I'm going to demonstrate those for you here. When you have to press the shutter button, it's going to tell you how many photos are left in your buffer. And in single shot mode, what you do is you hold down the button, and then you can hold this down as long as you want for the rest of your life, and the camera will never take another photo. This is 1 photo per shutter button press. If we push the lock release down and switch this one dial to burst, we're now going to get 3 frames per second until this runs out. We should be getting 3 frames per second until that runs out. There we go. That's what it's supposed to do. The button just wasn't quite seated, or the switch wasn't seated quite correctly. But as you saw here, that counted down from 4 to 1 and then stopped, and when that finished counting down, the buffer had been underrun and it stopped taking photos. This last option is self-timer. So when you push it, this light's going to light up right here to indicate that the camera's counting down. Should illuminate faster when we get to the end of the countdown, or just stay solid. And then after 10 seconds, the camera will take the photo. Here next, we're going to look at the mode dial. So we talked a little bit about these. Program mode, shutter priority, aperture priority, manual, ISO, white balance, quality, and autofocus point selection. The way that we're going to go through this is we're going to start up here in these functionality ones, and so we'll talk about those first. Autofocus point selection, you'll notice over here the LCD screen changes. If we rotate the rear command wheel, then you can choose between central autofocus point, or it will automatically select all the autofocus points. Those are your options right there. Quality. Here we go. When you select quality, notice here on the left side of the LCD, it says RAW. If I rotate the dial, it now says TIFF. Wow. Wow. I remember when TIFFs were a big deal in imaging. Huh. Fine, which would be JPEG with highest resolution. And then normal, which would be standard shooting. And then basic, which would be the most basic, most compressed image. So one thing to note is as you move through these, you can see all of the different numbers of files that you can save on your CF card. That's interesting to me. I didn't realize TIFFs were such a large image file, that is twice as large as the RAW file. So you can see over there how they change. That's it. Matter of personal preference, what image format you want to shoot in. I will say if you shoot in JPEG, you have way less editing power than you do with TIFFs and RAW files. Here we have white balance, and we're going to switch through the different white balance modes here. This first one here is called auto white balance. If you've used a digital camera, you're familiar with it. This is the auto white balance is the standard. The camera is going to look at the scene and determine what color profile is needed to have whites look white. Next up here we have tungsten. The camera is going to assume that your light is orange, and it's going to throw a lot of blue into the digital files to counteract it. Here is what looks like fluorescent. Yeah, that's the fluorescent symbol. And what fluorescent does is fluorescent light's kind of green. So the camera is going to throw a whole bunch of magenta into your image files to counteract that. Next up is daylight. This is where you're going to what you would use if you wanted to force daylight white balance outside. Next up is flash. Flashes are very blue. The xenon bulbs that flashes use create a blue light, so the camera will throw a bunch of amber in or yellow to counteract that. Next we have cloudy. Cloudy's kind of like a grayish blue, and so the camera is going to counteract that color cast with a very mild hint of warmth. And then here we have shade. So if you're taking a photo of someone in the shade of a building, that has a different color cast than a cloudy sky. And so this would be how you'd want to force that white balance. Now, I'm going to show you something really interesting that you can do with white balance. Oh, what's this one? Oh, pre. Pre will be a saved white balance, and I think we talk about that in the third video. But right now I'm going to show you something about white balance. You'll notice up here with these, there's a 0 for most of them, okay? All of them except pre. So let's say that you're shooting in tungsten light, and you're using some of those old Edison bulbs that have just, as of this video's recording, recently become banned. But they're very orange, very amber colored. And you're doing a couple test shots, and it's like, oh man, my photos still look unnaturally yellow. Go up here to the front command wheel, and you can increase up to 3, whatever arbitrary unit that is, the amount of blue in your images to make your images counteract even warmer tone lights. Okay, but oh, you know what? I know I'm under tungsten light, but it's kind of like blue. The whites are kind of blue. Well, you can reduce up to 3 arbitrary units the amount of blue being thrown in to compensate for your tungsten lighting. You can do that with all of the white balances except for pre. With automatic, I guess that if you're in tungsten, it will give you more blue, and if you're under magenta, or under fluorescent rather, it will give you more magenta, and if you're under full sun, it will give you more full sun. Anyway, that's what that 0 means. Our next one here is the ISO. So you can use the rear command wheel, that's it. 200 up to 1600, was it? Yeah, it goes up to, 1600. And then high 1 is 32, high 2 is 64. This is as of this video's recording, 21 to about 20 to 21-year-old camera. It was made till 2005, so, but it's old technology. The algorithms for ISO compensation are ancient in terms of computing, so realistically, I would not push this above 400 unless you're going to be shooting exclusively black and white, and you are happy converting the digital noise in your files into black and white noise, the digital color noise into black and white noise in post. So let's go down here into the modes, and we're going to start with program because it's the easiest one to understand. In program mode, the camera is going to look at the scene in front of you, and it's going to say, okay, I need 1/125th of a second in f/5.6, so let's do that. And you take the photo, and it does that. The camera takes control of the exposure out of your hands. Shutter priority. So program mode is a fully automatic mode. You basically don't have any input into the aperture or shutter speed unless you do program shifting, which is where we'll push down the exposure value compensation button, and you can increase or decrease your exposure value to force the camera to add less light, or, well, I guess to reduce light or to increase the light that reaches the sensor. Okay, so at any rate, that's a thing you can do. Shutter priority and aperture priority are semi-automatic modes. They function in a similar but opposite manner. In shutter priority, you control the shutter speed. Here we go, just like that. And the camera will tell you what aperture it's going to use to deliver a proper exposure. So if you have a specific shutter speed you want to use, like let's say I know that I want 1/3 of a second because that's a good speed for waterfalls. The camera in this lighting would give me an aperture of f/14, and I would have that exposure that I wanted. Okay. The converse is true. You could say let's assume you wanted a 1/1000th of a second shutter speed so you could freeze some motion. You don't have enough light here. Now we know we've got to go back to the ISO and adjust the ISO in order to get f7.1 for our depth of field, or for our aperture rather, at 100. Oops. Nope, still not enough. In this lighting, there is still not enough light for 1/1000th of a second to be used. So anyway, that's what the low means. It means that there's not enough light. I only went back to manual mode when I did that. That was the problem. Okay. So in shutter priority, you use the front command wheel. You select the shutter. The camera selects the best aperture. Aperture priority works in the same manner, but uses the rear command wheel. You select the aperture, and the camera will select the best shutter speed to give you the exposure that you want. So you can, I personally shoot in aperture priority the majority of the time. It's just my preferred mode. I have more interest in what's going to be in focus, and I'll deal with the shutter speed if I need to. Full manual is you control everything. Rear command wheel controls the aperture, front controls the shutter, and the camera will do whatever you tell it to do, whether that's right or wrong. But that's kind of an oversimplification of manual mode. So let's pretend that you're looking through your camera's viewfinder, okay? Here's your viewfinder. Here's your scene. You've got your sun, you've got a tree, whatever, okay? That's the photo you're going to take. Down here on the bottom, there's a bunch of different information. For manual mode, the important part is your light meter, which is going to look like something like this, okay? Proper exposure, too much light, too little light. And then there are some bars underneath this that light up, okay? So let's say that you are under here and this bar is lit up. The rest of them this way and this way are going to be dark, but everything in here is going to be lit up. This means you're a little bit too much light in manual mode. If this one is lit up and it's the first bar over this way, then you're a little bit underexposed. If everything over this direction, including one that kind of looks like a triangle or a triangle on a box over here is lit up, that means that your settings are over in this direction somewhere beyond what the light meter can display. You are way overexposed. And the same is true if you're over on this side and you have this pointy-sided one over here. You are way too little light. So in manual mode, what you want to do is set up your meter reading, but with using the aperture and shutter speed, so that the block in the middle here underneath the center point is the only one illuminated, and that will tell you that you have a proper exposure. Okay, let's go back to the top of the camera here, and we're going to talk about the flash modes button. So when I push this, what's currently in the autofocus points is going to turn into, or actually guess what's next to it, it's going to turn into a flash symbol. So when you push it, this right here tells you you're going to use fill flash, which means just the standard flash mode. That's what it's called. If I use the rear command wheel, now I'm going to get an eyeball there, and that tells me that we're using red eye reduction. Red eye reduction will pulse the flash once or twice, something like that. Every manufacturer does it a little bit differently, but it's the same principle. The flash pulses a couple times before it actually triggers, so that if you are taking a photo of a person or an animal, their pupil shrinks and you get less red eye or less reflection from off the retina in your photo. Next one is red eye reduction with slow sync. Let me try this again. This next one is red eye reduction with slow curtain sync. Now what that means is that with the first option for red eye, this one here, you could really only, I think you can only use it at the sync speed or at some of the faster shutter speeds right behind the sync speed. With this, you can use longer shutter speeds up to 30 seconds. So this allows you to, say, take a photo of a person at night with a cityscape behind them. It'll pulse the flash so that they don't have red eye, but then give you a long exposure so that you can capture both the person well illuminated by the flash and also the cityscape behind them. Slow sync is going to give you a flash sync on your longer shutter speeds so that you can do that without that exact photo we just described, without the person in it. And then rear curtain flash sync. So the way that a flash works is that I know that the curtain in this moves up and down, but my arms don't in this layout. So first curtain opens, and when it finishes its travel, typically that is when the flash fires, and then the second curtain closes behind it. In this camera, the 1/180th of a second shutter speed is that the first curtain opens, the entire sensor is exposed to light for 1/180th of a second, and then the second curtain closes. When that first curtain finishes, that's when the flash triggers. In rear curtain sync, it triggers right before the second flash travels. So instead of open, 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 flash, close, like that, it's actually open, 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 flash, close, like that. What's that do? At 1/180th of a second, at 1/60th of a second, it doesn't matter. That rear curtain doesn't matter at all. At 10 seconds, at 30 seconds, now that starts to matter, okay? So let's say, for instance, that you have a friend who's wearing some lights as they ride their bike through a dark alley. You can use your rear sync to take a 30-second photo of them as they're riding toward you, and then right as they're about to exit the frame, the flash goes off, your friend is illuminated, the lights behind them light up, and the shutter exposure finishes exactly when that flash fires. That's a classic example of something that could be done with rear sync. And those are the flash modes. There is one other thing about flash modes. The manual indicates that there is another flash mode called slow rear, which would be slow and rear together. It is apparently only available in shutter priority and aperture priority modes. This camera doesn't seem to have it. I don't know. Maybe it's a firmware thing. Maybe this is a really old one and that came out with later versions of this camera. I don't know. Honestly don't know. It should be doable with this camera. Doesn't seem to be. So we talked about this next button a little bit when we were in program mode. This is the EV comp button. And you can use it to force your camera to underexpose an image or to overexpose an image. This is only needed if you're in program, shutter priority, or aperture priority mode. In manual mode, You do this exact same thing by just cranking the shutter speed or aperture in a direction to force over or underexpose your image. So what you can do with your EV compensation is you can bracket your images for something like an HDR photo. Or if you aren't entirely sure how the photo is going to turn out and you want to try maybe a little bit more light, maybe a little bit less, see what you can do with the raw file and post with that. Or if you want to intentionally have a high-key portrait photo, for instance, or low-key landscape, for instance, you could do that with exposure compensation. But in manual mode, you don't use exposure compensation. You just adjust the settings yourself. EV is only for PS and A modes. Here's the bracket button. Before we talk about bracketing, if you hold it down with the green button up with the flash mode button, then what you will do is you will reset all of your camera's functions, which I accidentally did earlier. So don't hold those buttons down. I really hope you didn't already hold those down. Goodness. So here's the bracket button. What bracketing does is take a series of images. Okay, so I'm going to hold this while we look at the top of the screen, and I'm going to rotate the front command. No, the rear command wheel turns bracketing on and off. The front command wheel tells us how much. And so the information that you're seeing on the screen on the right, on the top right corner, it says 1.3. That's the amount of bracketing difference. If your proper exposure is 1/125th at f/5.6, in bracketing you might get 1/40th, 1/125th, and 1/320th. I think that sounds correct. All at f/5.6 for your 3 bracketed images. Now there it says plus 2f. Let's keep rotating this. Minus 2f. And 3. So the f stands for frames. And oh, dang it. So if you have 3 frames, right now, this setting right here, 3 frames, 1 under, 1 proper, 1 over, separated by 1/3 of a stop each. We'll go here to plus 2 frames. What that's going to do is that's going to give you proper, over, over, each separated by 1/3 of a stop. And if you do minus 2 frames, it's going to be proper, under, under by 2/3 of a stop. Am I right? Let's find out. Bracketing is on. So we can see here, I'm in program mode. It's going to be 1/40th of a second, well, 1/25th of a second at f/4.5, 1/40th, and okay, so 2f is only 2 frames. It's not 2 over, it's proper, and then 1 over. That makes more sense. And then we use the rear command wheel to turn bracketing on and off. And you can see here this little symbol that I should have looked at right here underneath the amount of exposure. It tells you where your frames are going to be. Proper over, proper under. Right now it's proper under. But if we keep rotating, you can see this symbol will change as we hit proper over. Wrong way. There we go. 3 frames, all 3 light up. Proper over, the center and the one to the right of it light up. So that's what this does, and that's how you read the information on the bracketing screen. Next thing we're going to talk about here is the flash EV compensation button. So I'm going to push this down, and on the top LCD screen you can now see that it says flash EV compensation symbol 0.0. And if I reuse the rear command wheel, I can intentionally overclock the flash up to a stop, or underclock it by up to 3. So how would this be useful? Let's say that you've taken a photo and you're in a studio and you realize that you've done a flash photo and there's something bright that's glaring in the background. You can reposition your flash slightly and adjust the power to prevent that glare and reflection in the background. You could intentionally overexpose your overclock your flash to overexpose your image and create a high-key portrait. You could intentionally underexpose it if you wanted to create dramatic dark lighting effects with your flash. So basically what the flash exposure compensation button does, right here on the back, is allow you to add more or less light to your flash power. I know that will work for the pop-up flash, and I believe it works for the system flashes from Nikon. I don't think it works with third-party flashes. Next, we're going to talk about this dial here around the the AEL-AFL button, this is your meter mode. So there are 3 modes: dot, dot in blocks, and dot in parentheses. That's not their real name. Dot in blocks is 3D matrix metering. And what this does is, with type G and D lenses, this will measure distance, contrast, and brightness in your scene for metering to give you the best metering result you can get. For 90 to 99.999% of your shooting, this is probably going to be the mode you just want to leave it in. Here on the bottom, what we call dot is actually called spot metering. This uses a 3mm autofocus point linked part area within your sensor, within your frame, I guess that'd be the most accurate term, for metering. It's important that it's autofocus point linked. Now I think there were 3-5 autofocus points. If you are taking a portrait of someone and you have their head up here, you're going to do a portrait orientation photo. You set this in spot metering. You set the autofocus point, which up here, or you get your autofocus up here on their face. Then what's going to happen is your photo will be exposed for their face being properly exposed. So spot metering is very useful if you're doing something like portraits and you want to make sure that the person you are photographing, that their face is what is properly exposed. You can also use spot metering for manual settings. It's very, very powerful because what you can do is you can take a meter reading off a very small area of the scene. I'm going to show you something right now about spot metering. I use spot metering for these videos. I'm going to turn off my auto exposure lock and I'm going to put this in the center spot of the frame. And you might notice that this just got really dark. And now everything has gotten as light as it possibly can be with the aperture that I have set on the lens that I'm using. So with spot metering, you have a whole lot of control over the lighting effects in your images. And so what you can do is you can take a meter reading off a very small part of your frame, and that will allow you to dial in very precise settings for that part of your image. You can also use a gray card, like I was showing you right here, my white, black, and gray cards. Whenever I start one of these videos, I take the gray card, I put it in the spot meter area, I get the shutter, I adjust the aperture manually on the lens I'm using to get it to whatever I want it to be, or whatever it can be, for the ISO I'm using, and to get a 1/30th of a second frame. This gives me a proper exposure across the entire frame because this is a good neutral tone. So spot metering is very useful for using a gray card if you're in a studio setting or doing product photography as well. Then up on the top here, dot in parentheses, is your center weighted. Now what this does is this takes an area in the center of the frame that's about an 8mm diameter circle, and the majority of your metering information comes from there. So I'm not going to turn the metering mode back again, but if we pretend that this is your center weighted area, then putting your gray card in the center of it will bias your exposure for the gray card, but whatever is outside of here will contribute some metering information. That's the difference between spot and center weighted. Spot is 100%. Center weighted is probably something like 75%, 25%, like that. And then matrix, of course, is looking at distance, tones, contrast all throughout the entire frame and doing very complicated math to determine the best exposure setting. While we're here, we're going to talk about the AEL-AFL button, and I'm going to punt this until video 3 because you can customize the functionality of it, and when we get to video 3, we'll get to the menus and I'll explain what each of the different functions are for it. Now we're going to go through the buttons down here more on the back. This is the monitor button. It does a thing. It turns the LCD on the back on and off. That's its job. Oh, hey, you can see the color shirt I'm wearing tonight because I was taking a bunch of photos of it. Okay, on and off. Menu button brings up the menus. The thumbnail button, when you are in playback mode, nope, that's not it. Here, when we are on playback mode, which is the monitor button, if we push the thumbnail button, oh, come on. So the way this is supposed to work is that it brings up 4 thumbnails. I wonder if my thumbnail button's shot. It's possible. So what the thumbnail button is supposed to do is bring up 4 different photos of my shirt in like a grid. All right, the protect button, what this does is the protect button allows you to protect images so that they can't be deleted. The enter button, I'm guessing that's going to zoom right now. Yeah, that's just zooming in playback. Okay, anyway, so in playback, the enter button zooms, and in the menu function, it acts as a confirm button. The crosspad is going to give us, in playback, will allow us to scroll through some information screens. I'm not going to pretend to be able to read that right now, but if you have this, you can use this to scroll through information screens. And left and right to scroll through information screens, up and down to scroll through images. So there we go. And then the delete button, of course, is the button you would use to delete a photo. I think that worked. I don't know. All these photos are basically the same, so I can't tell. Okay. So we've gone over everything but the menu system, and which we'll do very shortly. But right now, what we're going to do is talk about how to take a photo with the Nikon D100. The way that this camera is designed is you dial in all of your settings and you do all of your setup ahead of time. Select your mode, your drive, your ISO, all of these different things. Everything we have gone over up until this point, you dial in ahead of time, and then when you take a photo, you just push that button. One other thing you want to do when you take a photo is make sure you select your autofocus mode, which I forgot to include in my outline, so we're going to talk about it now. Autofocus mode, manual, servo, continuous. Manual focus means, it's supposed to mean, you do the focusing. Oh yeah, there's a switch on the lens too. Manual focus on your camera and on the lens together mean that you get to do the focusing, and whatever you select to have be in focus will be in focus. When you switch this to autofocus, S is servo and C is continuous. Okay, S means that the camera will hone in on something to be in focus, and it will hold that focus until you take the photo, as long as you continue to have to press the shutter button. C means that if your subject is moving, then the camera will track that movement as long as you have to press the shutter button. Single servo is really good for like portraits, classic example. It's also really good for something like tabletop studio photography or anything that isn't moving. Flowers would be another good example. Continuous is going to be really good for pets, kids, cars, anything that's moving around, going left and right or toward and back. Not tornadoes. If the tornado doesn't look like it's moving, you don't want to be in. You really want to get out of there. So anyway, just some advice on that. But so that's the point of servo and continuous. Single, stationary. Servo, you can think of it as stationary, even though it stands for servo, and C as being chaotic, even though it stands for continuous, like in motion. Anyway, I have muddied the water. So that's what you're going to do. You're going to dial in all of your settings. You're going to select everything you want, and then when it comes time to take a photo, you just hold down the shutter button until it takes a photo, and you have done everything with this camera. That's it for the second video. Third video, we're going to go over all of the menu items on this camera and talk about how to set up this camera so that it functions like you want and what each menu item does. See you in that video.